Hello again, and welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. If there's one thing that has affected every business in the world, more or less, in the last couple of years, it's been the pandemic, as we all know. One thing that offices have certainly perhaps even benefited from is the way that necessitated a move to remote working, virtual teams. But that's not necessarily a new practice or a new technology. It has been around for quite some time. My guest today is Marianne Snow of the Remote Nation Institute. Marianne is an expert in all things remote work and has been involved in remote and virtual teams for quite some time before the pandemic. So certainly an advocate for the benefits that they can bring to a business rather than just being a necessity or an imposed tool that we've all had to become familiar with.
Welcome to the Leading with Integrity podcast. Leadership talk for the modern manager. With your host, David Hatch.
Okay, well, thank you very much for joining me today. It's great to see you, great to meet you, really, the first time we've spoken. If I give you a chance to introduce yourself, tell us a bit more about you, your career background, what you're up to today, and what drives you, how you ended up doing what you're doing.
So, first of all, thank you so much for having me. My name is Marianne Snow, and I'm based in Providence, Rhode Island, which is about an hour south of Boston, Massachusetts, on the east coast of the United States. And I have probably one of the least linear career paths that you could possibly imagine. It was really driven by a curiosity, an interest in continuing my own learning and growth, and looking for projects and topics and things of interest to me personally that I felt were topical for my skills, and also just things that I really liked a lot. And that led me to have a lot of interesting projects, a lot of interesting career opportunities that included working with very large, complex international teams. And then that got me very interested in the dynamics in a virtual team situation where you have people who are coming together like we're coming together today, where we're in a time when this become everyone's living room in some ways, right? Where we have an opportunity to build relationships differently, to collaborate differently, to do things differently. And that has led me to create the Remote Nation Institute, which is really examining leadership in remote, distributed, dispersed, virtual, whatever you want to call it. There's lots of vocabulary around those teams that are not sitting together in the same room, physical space, and who are very technology dependent. And recently I launched a book on that topic, the remote work handbook, which is really looking to formalize a lot of the things that I've been learning out in the field, and also learning from other people who do this kind of work, so that we can standardize some of the work practices for folks who are managing in these types of environments, and also working in these types of environments, because they're quite different skills.
Yes, indeed. And am I right in saying that you were working on remote work before COVID?
Yeah, ironically, I was working in a distributed team environment as early as 1991.
Oh, wow.
And at that point, it was quite funny, because if you wanted to connect with a group of people and you were an individual, you would go into a recording studio, you would record, they would put it on what's called the VHS tape. A whole bunch of people probably don't even know what that is. We'd make copies of that VHS tape, and then I would put it in an envelope and take it to something called a post office, right? And mail it out. And I say that, with a certain level of facetiousness, but at the same time, last summer I had an intern and I asked her if she had ever been in the post office. And she said to me, well, when I was in middle school, my teacher took us once for a field trip to the post office, had us mail ourselves postcards. And I think I failed the assignment because my postcard never came. So that's the world we're living in.
No disrespect to the post office, but that sounds like a really boring field trip. Maybe that's just me. Well, I do remember VHS. We did have those when we were growing up and everything, and so yeah, maybe I'm not that young, but yeah, that's a funny word to say. How do you think, or how, from your perspective, how did that kind of remote work culture change as a result of the pandemic? What was the biggest change?
The biggest change, David, was it was really a proof of concept of how many work positions could be continued in a remote capacity. A lot of people have said to me, they've said things like, are there businesses that aren't conducive to remote work or distributed work? And I always tell people that's actually, you're not asking the right question. The right question is, what's your business model and what are you trying to accomplish? And then you should think of remote work and distributed work as a business strategy. But in the pandemic in 2020, and 2021 and even into 2022, all that changed because needs must, right? We suddenly were in a position where if we wanted to keep our businesses going, we had to think about different ways of getting things done. And we really pushed the boundaries, and there was a recognition that technology had advanced to such a place that we could cost effectively maintain a global economy. And it wasn't easy. And we were doing it when it was hard, when every country was experiencing some reaction to the pandemic, whether it was lockdown situations, whether it was restrictions on things, and people made it work. And they made it work not just for a week or 2 weeks, but for almost 2.5 years. And I think one of the things that's happening globally at this point is there's a big backlash because now you have senior leaders saying people have to come back in the office right at the moment where we've proved without the shadow of a doubt that we can have productivity without a nasty commute, at the point where not only are we going back into long commutes, but we're doing it at a premium price because of global gas prices and things like that. And it's a little insulting for folks who are working because they're saying, so you're telling me you don't trust me now and I have to come back to an office because you don't believe that I can work productively, but for the last 2.5 years, I kept your business running and not only did my job, but did it well. So I think there's a disconnect and a divide, but I think there's also a big pushback from a workforce that says, I kind of like picking up my child from the bus or taking my dog for a walk. And I don't see a problem with that.
Yeah, I kind of like being able to get out of bed and then start work 10 minutes later without having to spend an hour in the car or on the train and so on. Yes, it's an interesting problem, isn't it? And it's very easy, I think, to kind of blame the bosses and the kind of the business leaders who are just being old-fashioned and sticking in the mud and whatever else you want to call them. But they must be doing it for a reason, right? They must see that there's some value to the office, in inverted commas.
Well, but I think what's important to think about, David, is that what's the driver, right? I think that there's a couple of things, right? One is a natural interest in going back to good old times, right? Let's go back to the norm. Because if we go back to the norm, that's an indication that we're out of an emergency situation and we can actually get back to normal, right? And that's a natural human reaction. And I can appreciate that, and I can really value that and respect that. But if you're doing it because you want to get back to normal and you're not even acknowledging that there were business gains that were made, that there might be productivity gains, that there are opportunities to retool your business model, that we have a workforce that's going to demand flexibility anyway. So you can try and force it, but it's going to have an impact on your staffing levels. And then finally, are you doing it because you don't want to learn new business skills? Because it takes different business skills, different leadership skills, different approaches to manage a team that has to be more autonomous and more self-sufficient. And how do you evaluate your place in the hierarchy? How do you know you're the boss if you don't have a special parking spot and you don't have that special office with a corner window? If you can't manage the way that you've managed previous to the pandemic because it just won't suit in the new circumstances, then this is so I don't think there's one size fits all. I think it's a complicated situation, to your point. I think there's the human reaction, but I think that business leaders are supposed to be setting the direction for their organizations. Whether it's at the executive level from a strategy perspective, or whether it is from a leadership perspective and really maintaining productivity in the team. And so I think that people have to be a little more self-reflective and honest with themselves, because the plain fact is that someone who was inept in an office might be inept at home, or could actually thrive at home, and somebody who was productive in an office could go home and be productive, or they could not be productive, right? And suddenly you have just a little bit of a different context, and you're going to have to manage people differently because it's a new environment.
Yes, all fair points. I think as well, it comes back to what you were saying before about trust. Maybe some of the more backward-looking managers and leaders out there who are insisting on this return to the office, for them it is about trust. And then the question is, if you don't trust people when they're working remotely, then how is that any different in the office? You're still not going to trust them, are you? The difference is, during the pandemic, it wasn't that they were trusting people to work remotely necessarily. It was that they weren't given a choice by the government or the pandemic or the conditions and so on. It is an interesting one. Quite an ironic difference as well when it comes to change management, because traditionally, again, you'd expect the leaders would have to be managing the followers in terms of a change happening. Whereas with this issue, maybe it's almost in reverse, isn't it? Where the followers are the ones who are saying, well, look, change is happening. But nobody's managing that change now, because people who manage it are the ones who are resisting it.
Yeah, I think that's a very accurate statement. And I think it's also quite interesting, because I spend many times having conversations with my clients where I'm saying to them, the change management has already happened for you. Why would you try and force people to go back when clearly, whether we're discussing attire in the office, can you imagine trying to go back to a dress code in the office after 2.5 years, right? So let's not even talk about commutes. But I'll tell you that I have lots and lots of contact with groups that are being forced back into the office, and ironically, ask them what their meeting protocol is. How many are actually showing up in a conference room for a meeting, or how many are staying in their office and just coming in virtually? And I'll tell you that there are a lot of people who are just staying in their office, in their building, their company's building, and still not interacting with people in a physical way, because depending on your orientation, how you're feeling about being back in public, there's still a bunch of people who are saying, I don't need that type of interaction.
That's a bit mad, isn't it? So
I know.
People to just sit in a different room.
I
Very strange.
It's
doesn't
very
quite add up, does it?
interesting.
Yeah.
No, no. So I think mostly my view at this point is let's acknowledge that we're in a new time, and I want you to think about how much consumer behavior changed in the last 2.5 years. Whether it is ordering things online to be delivered to your door, whether it is attire, whether it is where we do work and how we do work, how we connect and how we stay in contact with people, how we network, how we develop business, all of these things. How many new business models got invented during this time period? I mean, I've been talking to folks in the event world, and this was an industry that was devastated by a pandemic that required no one gather. And so you have a situation where they had to pivot, and there was a discovery in that industry that you can actually make money with virtual events, and people are creatively doing that. And now that people are starting to gather and events are starting to occur again, it doesn't change the fact that every single event has a hybrid option. And there are some events that are completely virtual still, because now it's a genre. Now it's a niche.
Yeah, and I actually prefer them, if I'm honest. I've been to a couple in the last year or so, and it's so much less hassle. You lose so much less of your time than if you have to travel somewhere, and it's cheaper as well because they're not having to hire this massive venue, and it just makes so much more sense to me.
Yeah. even on the networking level, I'll tell
Yeah.
you that I've been to 1 or 2 in-person networking events in the last 6 months, and you can tell folks who have been craving that physical contact, right? It's almost as if they're going back into those rooms and they have their power suits on, and they're very defiantly sticking out their hands for the handshake because they're not going to acknowledge that anything has occurred, right? We're getting back to normal, and yet there are a lot of folks who are questioning whether that is the right path and whether that's of interest to them anymore.
Funny you mentioned networking. Actually, networking again is something I never really did before, but having come out on my own, and then the timing of doing that, if I wanted to do networking, it had to be online. So that's what I did. And I was actually at a networking meeting this morning, and it's so much better than having to travel somewhere and risk catching COVID. I mean, it's not a massive risk now compared to a few years ago, but I just find the conversations are better quality as well, because you're not distracted by the coffee arriving or by the conversation someone next to you is having, and it feels better to me, more productive, more useful, and less of a drain on your time as well. And time is money, as they say.
Well, think about it. I mean, part of that is, being in an unfamiliar place where there's physical proximity and there are social pressures that some folks are going to thrive in, and other people are going to have other reactions to. And the plain fact is that one of the things that I've heard in distributed teams is there is a very interesting phenomenon. And the very interesting phenomenon is, if you've been on a distributed team, because David, there have been companies that are distributed and dispersed well before the pandemic, right? It just, because if you're working in an international company that has multiple locations, then there's always kind of a home office, a mothership, right? And people who are in the home office and the mothership, those individuals were more visible, and they're more visible to the executives in the company, and that impacted a lot of things: career paths, your ability to speak at a meeting. And yes, there might have been things like conference calls before the pandemic, but conference calls before the pandemic were usually whoever's in the room is going to dominate the conversation. Whoever's on the call is multitasking, and if they can get a word in edgewise, then that's a lucky shot, right? And there were some of us who started to develop actual strategies for how to create visibility, but even we were penalized by folks because we weren't in the mothership. And in COVID, in the pandemic, when there were lockdowns and everybody was virtual, a lot of those people said they felt it was a level playing field for the first time ever, because everybody was virtual, right? Everybody was on the level playing field. And going back to the office, they're seeing huge loss of the gains, what they felt were gains, because they're saying, wait a minute, now we're being relegated to second-class citizenry again. And that's no fun.
Yeah, indeed. What I would have given to be able to do all those meetings virtually and have the opportunity to multitask. The amount of meetings I sat through in previous jobs, I think maybe 1% of them were productive. Would have been nice to be able to, go on mute and do some work while I'm listening to whatever was going on.
Yeah, I know.
Never mind, eh?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that really kind of speaks to companies that have developed meeting cultures that are, when you get to the point where I can remember my last corporate position where I started to feel like my job was going to meetings, and the follow-up to those meetings, any to-dos coming out of those meetings, they had to be done on nights and weekends, right? Because your entire business day was really traveling from meeting to meeting.
Yes, or more often than not, it just didn't get done.
Yeah, which is a
Depends
real
on the company.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah. Well, moving back to talking about yourself a little bit, if you don't mind, what's been your biggest professional challenge to date, and how did you overcome that?
I think one of the biggest professional challenges was when I started to learn that in distributed teams, you were talking about trust before. So trust is a really important component. And in distributed and in remote virtual teams, just like within every team, I think that ability to trust, but also to build trust among the members, so that if somebody says they're going to do something, they actually did it. And very early in my career, I was working on a really complicated technical rollout, and I'd been working with a group for months, and they happened to be in a different country. It happened to be a lot of the work was actually done through technology, even though I did travel to that country several times, not only at the kickoff, but at strategic points throughout. And yet on rollout day, I discovered that people were not honest with me about the amount of work that they had done. And I think probably the biggest lesson learned out of that was, if you're going to work in a distributed team, if you're going to work in a remote, or if you're going to just work in a team in general, trust but verify, right? There's a point in time where people are always saying to me, how do I know that things are happening? Well, set up a framework to be able to measure directly, so that you've got identified, call them KPIs, key performance indicators, call them deliverables, concrete deliverables. So it's not just to check the box, but there's some sort of a tangible indicator. You can actually, you need to do this whether you're in an office all together in the same physical space, or if you're in a distributed team. But in a distributed team, it's even more critical because people are out of sight, and failure to live up to those expectations, or to live up to your responsibilities, is just really, really destructive in remote and distributed teams. Because it's hard enough when you have people sitting in the same room that don't trust each other, but at least they can see each other. But if you're in a distributed remote team, then as soon as you're out of sight, and when there's little trust, my assumption, like every human's assumption, is to question somebody's intent, somebody's work effort, all of those sorts of things. So it was really important to me as I was thinking about remote work, what's the operating framework where people can have the best chance to be their best selves, but also where you can be a trusting person, but you can also avoid being a naive person.
Yes, it's a fine balance, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, and I was going to ask, but you already answered the question, which was how is it different to being physically in the same office? Because you've still got to, at a certain point, you've got to trust the work it's going to get done. But you already answered that very well. So I just won't ask that question. There we go. Yeah. On the opposite end, then we had the challenge. So, what achievement are you most proud of? What's the thing that you did enjoy looking back on it?
I think probably that some of the absolute best moments are when the teams that I've been working with who are in that distributed, dispersed environment are fully enabled so that they can work self-sufficiently and autonomously. And I can actually work to the top of my license, which is, I can check in, I can remove barriers, I can provide resources, I can advocate, and I can tell you that there was a particular time where we were doing a really complicated project. It was a learning university that had to be rolled out that was going to impact 28,000 people in 32 countries, right? And we had to do that in a way that there's a lot of change management components. And we worked with a lot of folks who were on the ground in those different countries and conscripted them. And those folks weren't necessarily well-versed change management advocates, but I helped to get them there. And so when that rollout occurred and things went well, that was a pretty fabulous experience. And then the other experience, which was fabulous, was I was working with a client. They happened to be a hearing aid distributor, and they were doing a major system rollout, technical rollout. And we did it with folks who were completely virtual, who had no experience in doing this sort of thing. We did all the training live stream. We actually did this at the beginning of the pandemic, just before the lockdown, but we had put the infrastructure in place. We'd worked with the team. We'd done the professional development. We had good executive sponsorship, and the rollout went without a hitch. And it wasn't me that did the rollout. It was the team that did the rollout, because they were enabled to be able to do that. And so I've seen the productivity gains when somebody is feeling that sort of self-confidence to be able to really operate to the top of their capabilities. And it's unique. It takes work, but when it works, it's fabulous.
Yes, very rewarding, it sounds.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's always nice when a rollout goes exactly to plan as well. I can't say that's ever happened for me. I'm glad to hear it does happen.
Although I won't say there weren't bumps in the road, but I think we planned for bumps, right? I mean, You and I both know, I mean, if you're going to do a rollout, it's going to have its variability. So you plan for what you can, you prep people for what you can't, and you tackle it as a team.
Well, I think it's fair to say that you've pioneered remote working and virtual teams, and certainly you've been doing it for a lot longer than I think most people who are currently doing it, because a lot of people it's only happened because they had to do it. And we've talked already, I think, about how many of those kind of business leaders are now looking to get people back in the office post-COVID. Yeah. Do you think remote work is going to be here to stay? Do you think it's going to endure? Are those leaders ultimately going to have to kind of bow to the inevitable?
Remote work was already in existence well before the pandemic. Anybody who's been working with a global team of folks, anybody who's worked on a technical rollout, right? As soon as companies started getting bigger, as soon as technology could enable people to connect, appreciate that we all know these little devices have had a big impact, because now we can run companies from our phones. I mean, there are some countries that are, They don't even use laptops as much as they use their cell phones now. I think that it is the leader population that thinks about the possibilities of what is cost effectively available today and really looks at remote work as a strategic option. It's not going to, most companies are not going to be fully virtual. I mean, there are some companies that are fully virtual, but most companies are not fully virtual. And yet, tell me somebody who wants a sales force sitting in the office all day long, right? There are a few companies where they're making cold calls from the office, but now the question is, do they have to make cold calls from the office? Are you going to pay for that overhead? Is that a good strategic choice? Or whether we're talking about a particular function, whether we're talking about, folks who have to actually interact with their clients. Because are you going to get on a plane every single time a client wants you? Or, how long before a client says, I don't want to go to lunch with you because I don't have that time? And so what's your alternative, right? So the question becomes, as the world shifts and consumer behavior changes and technology evolves, what's the best strategic choice for you? And that's how you should be thinking about remote or distributed teams. You should be thinking about it in relation to what are your business objectives and what's happening in the market and with your competition, or else you're not going to be business relevant long term.
Yeah, I think the cost point is, you would hope, would be the most compelling. I mean, as a business owner myself, I don't have any employees, but if I did, I can't imagine wanting to incur sort of 5-6 figures a month just for the privilege of driving to an office. When it's not necessary and it's not gaining me anything. I don't understand why more business leaders don't see it that way. It's very strange to me. Yeah.
And I think it's very important because I know that there are time periods where in business history you're bringing people to your office and it's obviously a point of how to impress, right? And yet even those things are changing. Think about it. In the last 2.5 years, we had intimate, very relevant conversations with lots of different people, while we also met their children, their pets. We saw their kitchens, before electronic backgrounds, before, people started coming into video calls, and they're doing it from their kitchen table or from their closets or from wherever. I mean, depending. What's the status symbol and what's an indicator of success in the business world today? Well, when are we going to get to the point where it's the bottom line in our P&Ls and those sorts of things? And what makes sense and what doesn't make sense going forward, I think, remains to be written.
Although, the quality of your product and service as well. I mean, that should be the ultimate thing, really. If you're the sort of business that you need the shiny office to kind of wow your potential customers, almost pull the wool over their eyes before they see what you're actually going to deliver.
Yeah, well, don't apply logic to an illogical situation.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Well, it's ego, isn't it? At the end of the day, I think it's just kind of showing off, I think. But
yeah, and I think that's an important observation, because I think leaders actually have to say to themselves, what's the driving force? Because we can have a productive team. We can onboard new people. We can mentor new folks to our team or our field. We can do all of those things differently than we did them 3 years ago. So why are you maintaining the framework? Why is it important for you to maintain the framework?
And why limit yourself geographically as well, is another way of looking at it.
Yeah, I think you and I are great examples of that. I think that while we might not have had the pleasure of crossing paths in previous iterations, I look at the opportunities that it provides us. And that's really exciting for a lot of people.
Yeah, it certainly is for me. I mean, I've had customers in Australia, in the States, and all corners of the UK almost. So if it wasn't for the access to this kind of online ecosystem, if you like, then I never would have met those customers, let alone worked with them. Don't know why you would cut yourself off from that, really.
And I think that this is really kind of driving change in lots of very interesting ways. We work with a lot of healthcare organizations. Telemedicine wasn't in the United States, was not a reimbursable service, right? You couldn't actually get paid for doing it before. But physicians and other providers were spending hours and hours answering emails and on the phone, and now they can do telemedicine visits, and there's a lot of indicator that they can be quite effective. So we are looking at all sorts of different ways that people are utilizing these types of technologies. And I'm not going to say that every single job is going to be fully suited to remote. I would say push your boundaries on thinking about that, and also think about your business model and think about what your industry is doing and what your customer behavior is today versus what it was like 3 years ago.
Yes, and the medical side of it, that's another interesting example of something, at least here anyway in the UK, that did exist before the pandemic. I can't quite remember why they did it now. It wasn't video conferencing either. It was literally you'd phone up a line and you get to speak to a doctor. But I think they probably did it because of waiting times and kind of turnaround in the waiting rooms and in A&E and all of that sort of thing. But it's another example, I think, of it predates the pandemic. This technology was already being used for these things, so it shouldn't be that kind of novel. We shouldn't be looking to go away from it as a get back to normal kind of strategy.
Yeah.
I'm biased, I'm sure, but
yeah, but I think, whether we're talking about healthcare or whether we're talking about things like how many times, there are restaurants who've been adopting kiosk technology for ordering. While there is charm and certainly value to going into a local pub. I've been in many a UK pub that was quite a wonderful and lovely social experience, right? And yet, there are time periods where you just are looking for a particular product, a particular service, and the social aspects are less of the primary goal, the primary driver. And so there are going to be people who are going to fill those needs.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the pub is perhaps one way it'd be very difficult to replicate that experience remotely. I don't think you could quite convey the atmosphere. But then, I think the government's kind of recognised that, and that's why that particular industry was given a lot of financial support throughout the pandemic. It'll be interesting to see if they get the similar support in the energy crisis in the UK, as pubs are one of the highest risk industries at the moment because they're just not going to be able to afford to keep the doors open.
Right. Yeah. These are, you really have to kind of think about the future, right? I don't think you can, if you're a business person, you're a small business person, I'm a small business person. And whether we're a small business person or whether we are the leadership in a much larger entity, you can't afford to just think about this week, next month, 6 months, whatever. You need to be looking down the road. It was really quite interesting. I did a project with Toyota, and I learned that Toyota plans 100 years in advance. They actually don't just look at, they're obviously doing short-term planning, but they also try and imagine 100 years from now. And I was saying to myself, what a unique and a quite extraordinary effort and extraordinary mind game that would be, right? To really kind of think about what's going to be here in 100 years, what's going to be relevant, what's business going to look like, what will people need, what will the world look like. And I was sitting there going, geez, think of all the data points you'd have to gather to even start that exercise.
Yeah, I mean, just think about the pace of change in technology as well, in particularly in industries like that. If you were doing that 100 years ago, how would you possibly have predicted like electric cars and what?
Yeah, isn't that? It's like it's quite an exercise, and
yeah,
but I thought it was quite illuminating. So I'm saying to people, where do you want your team and your company and your organizations to be 12 to 18 months from now, and then set that goal and then really start thinking about how your operating structure and your daily activities contribute to the forward movement towards that goal, because your minutes make your year. Your minutes help with goal achievement, how you manage those minutes and how you apply those minutes and how conscious you are with them.
Yeah, no, it's a good example with Toyota as well. I mean, they've got a pretty good history actually with kind of coming up with these new management practices and leading the way actually for a lot of industries, not just their own.
Right. Yeah, and I think part of this is not only maintaining an open mind and maintaining curiosity, right, but resilience to change, I think, is going to be really important, and also understanding that you're never done. You're never done learning. You're never done evolving. You're never done changing, because the minute that you hardwire yourself, I mean, we all, to a certain extent, we become attached to a routine, a process, a place, or whatever. And yet when you think about it, it's the folks who are maintaining an open mind and a curiosity and continue to push themselves to learn and try new things that are able to maintain relevance long term.
Well, something that I know I've talked about it in the past is kind of this problem with old leadership. I call it traditional leadership and that sort of old school management approach. Mm-hmm. So I talk quite a lot about why those are unsuitable for a modern workplace. Why do you think they're also unsuitable for remote teams, though?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. And I think one thing is appreciate that a remote team has to work autonomously in a self-directed environment and self-initiative and an operating structure that is around personal accountability is a requirement, right? And I think that that's an important distinction, because very often I call it lazy leadership. Lazy leadership is either we're going to try command and control, do it or else, which wasn't effective in the office and only got you short-term compliance anyway. And it's fear-driven, which means that's not going to be a good motivator, and it's not a good formula for productivity over the long term. But then you've got the second piece, which is a well-meaning person who got promoted because they were a great doer, but they transitioned to leadership and they maintained themselves as a doer as opposed to a leader who is enabling their people to be self-sufficient. And so their identity and how they evaluate themselves is going to be based on, you come to me with your problem, I'll solve your problem, or I'll jump in and do it myself, and in that format, in a remote and a distributed team, it's unsustainable because everybody has to pull their own weight and really kind of live up to their responsibilities. And so remote teams that are mature, that are functioning really well, have a framework where there's accountability on all sides. We just did a kickoff meeting with a group that we're going to be working with on a really complicated project that actually involves space travel. We'll be putting some stuff on the International Space Station. Now, this team is not going to work together in the same physical space, but we sat down with folks who don't think of themselves as part of a remote team and talked about, here's what's in it for you, but here are the expectations. Here's what you can expect from us. Here's what we expect from you, so that going forward, there are no surprises there. Now, I don't expect everybody to be fully on board and perfectly behaved from the get-go. But I think leadership that understands that this is about helping people to evolve and to see their own personal and to take their own personal responsibility for their deliverables, their roles and responsibilities. And that's a big paradigm shift, David, because in an office, it's really easy, and we've all seen it, where it's, we get to blame it on somebody else, right? We get to blame it on someone else. We get to shift responsibility elsewhere. And it happens at the leader level. The leaders blame another team. The team member blames another colleague, and in remote and distributed teams, they're smaller. They're usually smaller, and they're pretty nimble. And it's the very mature remote teams that are functioning at a high level where people are feeling accountability at an adult place. So really interesting remote teams are adults leading adults, and the accountability is on an individual basis.
Yeah, I can't think of a single team I've ever worked in that would have suffered with more accountability. it's an essential for leadership in any environment, in my experience. But yeah, I totally agree with what you say about it being even more necessary for remote teams.
Yeah, mostly I think it's a construct where a leader in a remote team that's doing their job right is shifting full accountability to their folks, even though in a leadership role, obviously the leader is going to be fully accountable for the output, right? So it doesn't change the fact that the leader is responsible for the output within their organization. How they achieve that output has to be done differently. It can't be through flogging. It can't be through doing it themselves. It can't be through horse and carrot sort of thing. Those things aren't going to work. It really has to be making sure that you've set expectations and that you have given the resources, whether it's professional development, whether it's just access to systems, whether it's, introducing the team and setting the ground rules for interpersonal interaction, and then doing the check-ins, milestones, whatever, to hold the team accountable to its own performance.
One of the arguments you hear quite a lot against remote work is that it's too difficult to create that sort of the meaningful work environment, the organizational culture, because you lack those sort of the informal interactions, the water cooler chats, people call them. Do you agree with that view? I'm guessing not, but can you really create those meaningful environments in a virtual workplace, do you think?
I think we shouldn't over-romanticize an office environment. And that's not to say that I haven't worked in some office environments that weren't highly functional, because I have. And I'm sure you have too. So there are instances where you have high functioning work cultures that have that high degree of collegiality and personal responsibility and who actually enjoy working together. But I would argue that when you are in a typical corporate environment, we can all point to situations where colleagues annoy us, when there's a lot of discord, where there is dysfunction and distrust, where management is engaging in practices that disincentivize a team or destructive to a team. Every single one of us has had a nasty boss. I mean, there's a reason that a lot of people are not excited about working in an office. And so I think we have to be careful about over-romanticizing and assuming it's an all or nothing proposition, right? If you've got a high-functioning team with a highly effective culture, you're achieving your business goals and you are leading in your industry, your niche, your market segment against your competition, then you should be thinking about, great, how do I sustain it? And can I sustain it in my current environment, or do I need to make adjustments, right? What are my competitors doing? That sort of thing. And I think it's just really a case of, we can't continue with business as usual. And we absolutely can't tell ourselves that working in an office was a joyful, happy, exciting, and energizing place, because I just don't believe it.
No, I must say I don't either. I often wonder, the people who are saying these things and asking those questions, you think, have you actually ever worked in an office?
I know.
Because if you have, I'd like to work in that office, please.
Me
it
too.
sounds amazing.
Right. And I think that's the thing. That's the thing that I find so, don't over romanticize it, because people are people, and people are messy. And when you bring people together, I don't care if it is in an office setting. And I would argue that when you bring people together in close proximity, and then you add a stressful environment, or you add, maybe if your company is not doing that well, there's that stress. If your company's doing really well and is growing by leaps and bounds, another kind of stress. And those stresses start impacting people's behavior. And when you're in close proximity, who's managing that? How are we moderating that? What kind of, and also, how many companies actually sit down and say, this is the kind of culture we want to build, and then role model those behaviors? And there are lots of people with lots of value statements on the walls. And I've seen a lot of companies with those value statements probably every single day, every single minute, violate their own values on a routine basis. So,
yeah, well, I think the answer to the question is not enough companies are consciously thinking about those things.
Right.
No, you're right, though. It is, at the end of the day, it's about the people, isn't it? And I'm sure a lot of people, just like me, the enduring memories of, the positives and the what you're enjoying about your work. It was about the people that you're interacting with, the people that you were working with. It wasn't about the place you were doing it. It wasn't about the company you were working for, even necessarily. It was just about, those personalities, the people you saw every day that you didn't hate or not get on with, or whatever. There's always one or two of those everywhere. Maybe I'm the problem, but.
I mean, I think we all have to own it, right? Because we all have good days and bad days. And quite frankly, we probably annoy someone, right? Because it's sort of our role in life. Not everyone will love us, and such is life. But I think what's important is, on a fundamental basis, I think we can't have these broad, sweeping statements that something can't work, or something can only work in a particular construct, because I think the world is messier than that. I think life is messier than that. I think once, it's going from that sort of strategic broad view and going through the implementation process. And you're an implementer, I'm an implementer. And the plain fact is that, it's a messy business.
Yeah, absolutely. As is anything that involves humans. Yeah.
Anything. Yeah, people are messy.
Indeed.
They're just messy.
Yeah, and they don't all fit into the same box. Yeah.
No. That's the fun part for me. I mean, I really enjoy that. I really love what I do, but at the same time, it's also, and I think you can be successful in any construct, but I think you can also be unsuccessful in any construct, depending on how you approach it.
What are your biggest lessons learned about leadership and management?
I think the biggest leadership lesson is, I think you have to meet people where they are. And what I mean by that is, leading by definition is getting things done through others. And I don't think you can, as a leader, come to the table presupposing what someone's capable of or not capable of any day of the week, any hour of the day, any part of the year. And I think that that's really important because the hardest part about leadership is always the people, managing the people, getting them moving in the same direction, enabling them to be the best they can be, enabling them to move forward. And how do you manage them on good days and bad days, right? And I think that this is important because you have to balance, because if you're working in an organization, you're working in a company, it's not a mental health service, it's not a welfare service. You still have to deliver the goods, work still just has to get done. There's only so much personal preference you can accommodate. But at the same time, I think you have to acknowledge that as a leader, it's all about your ability to be able to influence, persuade, create trust, enable, sometimes, cajole, sometimes encourage, and sometimes absolutely require people to do things. And then I think you need to be honest about giving them feedback when they've absolutely done a fabulous job and when they've not. If you're going to be a leader at all, I think you need to be able to be honest with people about observations in relation to the requirements, right? I gave you expectations. We set a structure. I'm going to hold you accountable. Even if I love you, even if you're my favorite person, even if you're a great performer, there are days that you're going to disappoint me. And there needs to be, the skill set to be able to manage that message, but also that we can't rush to judgment, right? That we have to have some sort of a sense of why someone's failing, particularly in a remote team, because it's easy to make assumptions. And I think you have to really kind of look at what the drivers are. And you should be always asking a very simple question to yourself, which is, what kind of problem am I trying to solve here? Who is this person? What's the history? What are their trends? What's typical for them? What are the previous conversations I've had with them? Those sorts of things. And you're going to have to do it instantly. You're going to have to do it in the moment. It's not for the faint-hearted. This is really hard work. But I would argue that this applies whether you have someone in an office or whether you don't have someone in an office. But in distributed and remote teams, office is more forgiving in the sense that you can, that proximity allows a certain latitude where you can go in behind a closed door and yell and scream at each other and kind of work things out, or, people just leave. But in remote distributed teams, people can just go silent. You can have that disappointment. And if you're not cued in on that, it's easy to have someone just really disengage.
Yes, you have to be a bit more conscious about the communication, don't you? And perhaps more careful about it as well, because it's a lot easier to misinterpret body language and things when you're not in the room.
Yeah.
But then equally, I've worked with people in the past where the kind of the ghosting happened, even though we were physically in the same office. So it can go either way. Yeah.
Yeah. People, it's always the hardest part. Emotional intelligence. And then, think about communication in today's world. It's very much, I call it the O to O effect, right? You're online to offline to online to offline. And it's an extended conversation, because I might have 25 touch points with you throughout the day, but those touch points can come a video, phone, text, chat, water cooler, email, think about all the ways. We might be connected on a social channel. We could be LinkedIn buddies. I mean, there are so many ways that you are showing pieces of yourself, that you are presenting information, in the absence of body language, which is how people interpret about 93% of the context and intent. In a all digital environment, that 93% is replaced by how I'm feeling today. So if I got up in a rough mood, and our relationship, how much I trust you. So if we had a terrible interaction, 5 days ago, and I send you an email, you will still have the last tone of voice or the last emotional reaction based on how you're feeling about me today.
Yeah, particularly with those kind of the text-based forms of communication, they're notorious, aren't they?
Yep.
Email is always so easy to misinterpret. And even simple things like kind regards versus best regards. And, why did they say kind and not best? What have I done? And it's a minefield.
I know, it's really interesting. Texting is much more intimate. Email is much more formal. Chat it's kind of a quick hit, and it's usually without grammar and pretty choppy. It's a minefield in lots of different ways, because you're really you have to really kind of think about. People are evaluating that based on those 25 touch points throughout the day. If there's inconsistencies in the delivery, you have to be very explicit if you're going to work in these environments. You have to be able to say, hey, what did you mean by this? Or can we have a phone call? Or, can we, jump on a video chat? And just clear things up as quickly as possible, because stuff is going to pop up.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing where it's not just incumbent on the leaders to do that. I think, miscommunication takes two, doesn't it? So,
yes.
While the leader may be more motivated to resolve it, they may also not realise that there is a miscommunication. They might not realise they've upset someone. So, people who are being led have also got to be able to have kind of the confidence and the psychological safety and the trust in their leaders that they can raise something and say, look, did you mean it that way? Because this is the way I've read that.
Right.
Which is an even more difficult challenge for leadership, because you're the one who has to build that environment, aren't you, at the end of the day?
And then you have to maintain it, even though somebody's going to come to you and say, did you really mean to be such a whatever? Was that your intent?
Yes. Did you mean to make so-and-so think that you want to murder them, or was that unintentional?
Right.
Anyway, moving on. Something else that I know you've spoken about in the past is extroverts and remote working. Does that mean that you think introverts are perhaps better at virtual work, or am I reading something into that?
Well, I think, introverts and extroverts, it comes down to where you get your energy from, right? Extroverts, by definition, in the current context of an extrovert definition, it's if extroverts are gaining their energy from physical contact, right? As opposed to introverts gaining their energy from alone time, some, recharge time. I think here's what I think, David. I think it's changing. And I'll give you a very clear example. So for the last 2.5 years, I'm very fortunate to have contact with lots of young folks, like very young, 2, 3, 4, that sort of thing. And clearly pandemic lockdowns had a big impact on socialization for that particular group, right? And for the last 2.5 years, I've been doing an online story time with my young loved ones. We've had a very small group for young ones who have literally spent 2.5 years together daily having a story time with 4 people, 4 other young ones who live in completely different places. They know each other's names. They've seen each other's faces. They wave hello. They send kisses goodbye. For the very first time this summer, some of them have been meeting each other. Like, it's the first time they've actually physically met each other. Appreciate for them. These are the young ones who do things like they get up on the table and they put their eye next to the camera and they say, "What are you doing in there?" Right? And they say, "Well, can you stay for lunch?" And they're eating in their place and I'm eating in my place. And for them, we're still eating together. When we brought them together physically, it was as if they'd never been apart. There was not a lot of social awkwardness. They were actually connecting. They were holding hands. There was and so appreciate that when you're talking about introverts and extroverts now, how people are viewing getting together as humans and how people are making connections as humans is changing. So I think old models of extroverts can only get their energy feed from physical presence. I would argue now we have podcasting. Now we have live stream events. Now we have other ways that people are connecting with each other. Old models are being turned on their heads. And I think generations that are coming into the workforce now who've never known a time without a cell phone, to the point we were making earlier about boring, school trips to the post office, all of that sort of stuff, I think all bets are off. And so what is going to be driving an extrovert versus driving an introvert, I think is going to shift appreciably.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of looking at it. It never would have occurred to me. But as you were talking, I was, again, thinking about myself as well, because, 3-4 years ago when I was full-time working in an office, I never in a million years would have gone near social media. I wouldn't have done a podcast. I wouldn't have gone to a networking meeting or any of those things. And I've always been naturally an introvert. But then today, all of that's almost second nature. I'm doing something like that every day. And It doesn't bother me in the slightest. Whereas, even 3 years ago, that would have terrified me. It's very strange.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That adaptable extroverts started to find different outlets. I think adaptable introverts are leveraging the advantages of the environment. How people interact in the future it's already evolving. It's already changing.
Leadership heroes. So the question is, if you had to pick a person, any person, alive or dead, past or present, real or fictional, if you like, who, in your opinion, perfectly embodies leadership, who would that be and why?
Nelson Mandela, a really interesting human being, right? Was leading in an unbelievable time and had to navigate a lot of really sticky wicket problems, very, very, very challenging human dynamics. And it could have gone lots of different ways. Also had to cede power gracefully and then take a step back, even though, the country was in a really precarious position. And one could argue whether the current history has played itself out, but in some ways we all play our leadership role in our time, right? You only get whatever you get in your time. Extraordinary human. I would totally love to have a conversation around what the drivers were behind the decision making, how to maintain your sense of purpose when it would be really easy to, there were so many ways that could have gone badly. I think it's a great case study, but I think it's a great case study where you have one person who has to now impact many people. Great communicator, really interesting personality, not perfect by any means, but at the same time, I think extraordinarily effective.
Yes, no, that's a good pick. We've not had that one before. One of the interesting things to me about Nelson Mandela was kind of the way he, in his youth, he very much was fighting against the system. And then in his later life, he essentially was the system. And that must have been a really challenging kind of transition for him.
Yeah.
But he, I think, handled it with quite some grace, ultimately.
Yeah, but think about it. I think it's always easy to be the critic. It's one should take care. It's easy to have opinions about the leadership that's in power until you're actually in that role, and then you have to navigate. And I was listening to a really interesting thing with there's this app called Masterclass, and they do very interesting e-learning programs with notable personalities. And they had something with Madeleine Albright, who was our first woman Secretary of State, and Condoleezza Rice, our second woman Secretary of State. And one of the things that they talked about is doability, right? What's doable in that moment and that context with all of the things. And when you're living in complex environments, and I don't care if we can translate to our families, to our professional lives, to the world at large. I think, when you're in the middle of it, it's complicated to you, right? And navigating those complications, it always seems easier when you're looking from the outside, and when you're sitting on that leadership hot seat, it's a whole different viewpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. It's always easier to criticize from the outside, isn't it? You're
right.
Yeah. Not just in leadership, just in general.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Final kind of question really is just to give you an opportunity if any of the listeners would like to learn more about you and what you do and the Remote Nation Institute. Is there a website they can go to, an email address, or where would you like to point them towards?
Absolutely. I think, first of all, come and find me on LinkedIn, Mary Ann Snow, and join me here and be part of a conversation. I always like having that conversation contact first. We can talk about what your motivations are, and we can take it from there.
Great. Well, thank you very much for taking the time. It's been great talking to you.
It's been wonderful talking to you, David, and you have a great afternoon.
You too. Thanks a lot. Thank you again, Marianne. That was an awesome conversation. Really enjoyed hearing all of your insights about leadership and virtual teams. Listeners, if you would like to learn more about the Remote Nation Institute, or just get some advice on virtual teams and how best to manage them, you can reach out to Marianne via her LinkedIn profile. I'll put the link in the description. You can also check out her website. I'll put the link down there as well. Thanks again for listening, everyone. I hope you found it educational and I hope you found it interesting. And remember, be a leader, not a boss. See you next time.